We stand today at the threshold of a great event, both in the life of the United Nations and in the life of mankind. This Universal Declaration of Human Rights may well become the international Magna Carta of all men everywhere. We hope its proclamation by the General Assembly will be an event comparable to the proclamation of the Declaration of the Rights of Man by the French people in 1789, the adoption of the Bill of Rights by the people of the United States, and the adoption of comparable declarations at different times in other countries.
That was Eleanor Roosevelt, former First Lady of the United States, addressing the 58-member countries of the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. This year marks the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and so that's our topic for this show. I'm Manolo, Quezon, the Explainer. This is The Explainer, where we explain why issues are issues. Now, our explainee tonight is a writer for ANC, BJ Ramos. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Manolo. So I guess I'll invite our audience to participate in today's discussion. You can text REACT space X space your name and your question or reaction and send to 2366 for Globe and Sun and 231 for Smart. Or you can log on to www.the-explainer.com.
And we're joined in the studio by journalism students from the University of Santo Tomas. So welcome to the show. Now, our discussion on why we are free after this. There's a reason the United Nations chose Eleanor Roosevelt, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's widow, to be the chairman of the commission that drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But before we get into that, as Eleanor Roosevelt herself told the UN's General Assembly, there was a particular reason the UN thought the time was ripe to make a Universal Declaration of Rights in the first place. This famous sketch by the artist David of his work, The Tennis Court Oath, tells us why. That was the proclamation of the rights of man by the revolutionaries of France in 1789. The idea that there were rights that were each and every person's to exercise, not by divine favor or royal grace, was a legacy of that revolution. Now, the ideas of inherent natural rights, of liberties that were an essential part of being human, inspired our founding fathers, from Rizal, whose contemporaries looked to the Enlightenment in Europe for inspiration, to Apollinario Mabini, who tried to find a practical application of those rights in his true Decalogue and in his proposed draft for the Constitution of the Malolos Republic. Now, even when our Malolos Republic was crushed by the force of American arms, the ideas of universal rights continued to inspire Filipinos, and as far as similar principles were shared by foreigners, provided the means for restoring our freedoms. Now, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, during whose administration the Jones Law was passed in 1916, making the question of Philippine independence no longer a question of if, but rather when, took the anti-imperialist platform of his Democratic Party further and proposed sweeping principles to govern international conduct in the wake of World War I. Now, Wilson proposed an international body to uphold such principles as the right of self-determination, which would be known as the League of Nations. But the League of Nations proved powerless, unable to prevent the outbreak of World War II. And so it was, ironically, this man, Adolf Hitler, who pushed the Wilsonian ideal of an international body to prevent war forward. Now, Winston Churchill, trying to find ways to obtain American support for Britain, almost single-handedly faced Hitler's might, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, increasingly concerned about the ability of the world's democracies to resist fascism, had to find a way to keep Britain's resistance going while avoiding antagonizing American public opinion, which at that time was skeptical about risking lives and money for what Americans considered the petty quarrels of Europe. On August 14, 1941, the two leaders met and came to an agreement on broad principles that they christened the Atlantic Charter. These were ideals that were meant to rally the democratic world to fight fascism and to outline the objectives of that fight. Now, what were those ideals? First, their country sought no aggrandizement, territorial or other. Second, they desired to seek no territorial changes that did not accord with the freely expressed wishes of the people concerned. Third, they respected the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they would live, and they wished to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who had been forcibly deprived of them. Fourth, they would endeavor, with due respect for their existing obligations, to further the enjoyment by all states, great or small, victor or vanquished, of access on equal terms to the trade and to the raw materials of the world which were needed for their economic prosperity. Fifth, they desired to bring about the fullest collaboration between all nations in the economic field with the object of securing for all improved labor standards, economic advancement, and social security. And sixth, after the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny, they hoped to see established a peace which would afford to all nations the means of dwelling in safety within their own boundaries, and which would afford assurance that all the men in all the lands might live out their lives in freedom from fear and want. Seventh, such a peace should enable all men to traverse the high seas and oceans without hindrance. And eighth, they believed that all of the nations of the world, for realistic as well as spiritual reasons, must come to the abandonment of the use of force, since no future peace could be maintained if land, sea, or air armaments continue to be employed by nations which threatened or might threaten aggression outside of their frontiers. And they believed, pending the establishment of a wider and permanent system of general security, that the disarmament of such nations was essential, and they would likewise aid and encourage all other practicable measures which would lighten for peace-loving peoples the crushing burden of armaments. So when the United States joined the war after Pearl Harbor, the Atlantic Charter became, in essence, the mission vision statement for the Allied cause, and the Allies became known as the United Nations. Roosevelt himself boiled down the Allied mission vision statement to what he called the four freedoms that all people allied in the fight against Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo were fighting for. To disseminate those four freedoms, the American artist Norman Rockwell was commissioned to design four posters, and here they are. Freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom of speech, and finally, freedom of worship. Now, when I go around schools, I show these images to school kids and ask them to reflect how freedom can be freedom from something as much as freedom to do certain things. Now, the principle of self-determination for peoples, which dated back to Woodrow Wilson and was part of the Atlantic Charter, was a powerful force for mobilizing public opinion for people like ourselves. And indeed, even though independence wasn't yet formally proclaimed and our territory was under Japanese control, in 1943, the Philippines joined the ranks of the United Nations. Now, in 1945, the Germans, Italians, and Japanese having been defeated, the transformation of the United Nations from wartime alliance to international peace body took place. Again, the Philippines, not yet independent but already recognized as in all other respects part of the community of nations, was among the charter members of the UN. Now, in this next picture, you see Carlos P. Romulo, our first ambassador to the UN, signing the US treaty with our first generation of diplomats in the background. And with the ravages of World War II in mind, including the genocide perpetrated by the Nazis and the war crimes undertaken by the Japanese, the global community set about coming up with a covenant to prevent such things ever taking place again. It would be a declaration of rights, but this time universal. And that's what we'll tackle when we return.
These are your human rights. There are 30 of them. They belong to you. You don't have to buy them, or apply for them, or ask permission to have them. They're just yours.